Welcome to the Alchemy Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Strong. And in today's episode, we're going to take a bit of a different direction than what we have been doing thus far. And I'm going to attempt to unpack a concept or an idea that we've been working pretty closely with at Alchemy Brothers over the past weeks and months. And that's around the stress response, regulating in the face of adverse challenge in our lives. How to meet stress with greater ease. So I'm going to speak in such a way that I'm going to allow a flow of ideas to unfold, and there's not an exact format that I'm following. I've got a few ideas of what I want to get through. So let's see how this content unfolds. And yeah, to kind of give a bit of a check-in at the outset here, I'm right now experiencing a little bit of stress, a little bit of anxiety in the face of bringing myself to this task, in the face of sharing my words with you, how it's going to be received. Am I going to give an adequate representation of this concept? Am I going to represent myself well? Am I going to represent Alchemy Brothers well? So yeah, there seems to be a little bit riding on what I'm sharing here, and I'm noticing that it's arising as a bit of a tightening in my belly and in my chest and a little bit in my lower back as well. I can sense some sensitivity. And just as I bring my attention to these places and deepen my breath there, I'm already sensing that dissipate somewhat. Letting myself be held by the ground. We're going to circle around to some strategies that you might find useful in meeting the stresses within your life. But to give a bit of an overview of how it is that I would like to unpack this subject for you. My background is in movement and somatic therapy, somatic coaching. So I tend to view everything through the lens of the body and how the body meets the world, how the body contacts with mind as well. So this embodiment, this way that I approach things, the language that I use is coming from that kind of a background. And the other lens that I tend to view this work through is men's work, and my work with Alchemy Brothers, my work with the men themselves, and they're not so distinct. There's so much overlap between them, but I tend to bring this knowledge from one field into the other and from the other back. So there's this cross-pollination. You might hear that come through in how I present these ideas. And just to say as well is that I find that the basis for any kind of personal work, personal change work, personal development work, whatever label you want to give it, for me rests in embodiment. That is the foundation for any kind of a change that we might want to make in our lives. And it's a word that I see referenced a lot in men's work out in the field. Yet I do not always sense that there is a true grasp of what embodiment is and how it can directly be utilized and leveraged into the field of men's work. Often it's some breath work, an ice bath, maybe some qigong and boxing or something like that, and that's embodiment for some. And I'm not downplaying the value of that. That is incredibly powerful practices to engage within. But what I'm interested in is how we can utilize the wisdom of our body, the intelligence, the awareness, the signaling, the experience of ourselves to bring about change within our lives, change that's going to land, change that's going to stick. And in particular, I find that men value from this work uh, incredibly well. And the reason why is because the body, it's here, it's tangible, it's real. I can touch it, I can move it, and I can enact through it. It is far easier place to intersect and create change than the mind through thoughts and cognition and these fleeting uh, moods that pass through us. If we can land and ground our experience in the body, we then have this solid foundation to explore ourselves, to explore our connections with others, to explore our relationships with others, environments. So this is the foundation that I kind of bring behind. And as we unpack this subject today, this subject of the stress and the nervous system, I'm going to use a different kind of language. I'm going to try to ground this in a little bit more practical, embodied language as opposed to some of the scientific stuff. So stress, what a big subject, what a big concept that seems to be this ever-present force that we are contending with or wading through within our lives. And often stress nowadays has become villainized. There's this looming state or this looming force of stress that is imposing itself upon us, and we must attend to it. We must beat the stress. We must conquer the stress. We must eliminate the stress from our lives. And I've got a bit of a reality check for you, is that you're never going to remove all of the stress in your life. It's not going to happen. Stress is an innate part of the human condition. It's an innate part of the world condition. It's through stress that evolution occurs. Stress has always been part of the experience. It's this dialogue between organism and environment. The environment stressing the organism stressing the environment, the organisms stressing each other. And as a result, we evolve, we adapt, and we kind of come together in this interdependent reality where we're pressuring each other to change. So to have the goal to eliminate stress or conquer stress is probably setting the wrong flag post in at the outset. Rather than conquering the stress, let's see if we can perhaps come to terms with the stress, learn how to utilize stress in such a way that we can optimize our response, our adaptive response to stress. And let's take it right back down to the word stress. And it comes from the root in Latin of strictiare. Hopefully I pronounced that right, which means to tighten or to compress, to draw together. So there's this real kind of binding, tensing that occurs. And it's probably very similar to the embodied response that you have when you're experiencing or when you're in the midst of a stressful experience. When you're exposed to that stress, you quite likely bind yourself. You quite likely tighten and draw yourself together and compress in the face of the stress. It's a very natural response to shrink, to control what is uncontrollable in that moment. This embodied attempt to bring things into our capacity. Essentially, the stress response is triggered when the situation, the perceived situation, exceeds our perceived capacity to cope. So I'll let that land for a moment and perhaps repeat. When the situation that we are confronting exceeds our capacity, our perceived capacity to cope. If we take the inverse of that, if the situation is within our capacity to cope, then all of a sudden it's not stressful. It's just another thing that needs to be done within the process of doing it. And the stress response is very different than if the situation is beyond our capacity. Essentially, what we're asking is the world friendly? The nervous system is constantly asking that question. Is the world friendly? Am I safe? If the answer is yes, the world is friendly, the situation at hand is within one's capacity to cope, then we are in a parasympathetic nervous system state. This is the rest and digest state, right? This is when we have our greatest immune function, when our digestive system's working well, we're socially engaged, we're playful, and we're breeding as well. It's also called the breed and feed response. Now, if the answer to the question, is the world friendly? If that comes back as no, the world is not friendly, there is a threat. The situation, the world is beyond the capacity to cope. Then we activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is also called the fight-flight response. All the blood rushes to the limbs, to the extremities, and we become primed for engagement. We become primed to fight the situation or to get away, to run away from the situation. If we were to transport this experience back into our prehistoric selves, right? We can use let's use the very familiar situation of the saber-toothed tiger. You walk out of your camp, you're going on a hunt, or you're going out to forage, and all of a sudden you come across paths with a saber-toothed tiger. Your stress response, which was on some level of alert because, the environment wasn't safe, you were scanning, you were kind of in a stage 1 activation. Now all of a sudden the saber-toothed tiger is there and you engage much more. You prime your body to fight or flight, right? There are other stages of activation, but we're not going to go into that in today's talk. Let's stay with this stage of fight and flight. You engage with the saber-toothed tiger. You either defeat it or scare it away, or you manage to escape. Whatever the case, you come back to your tribe, you come back to camp, and when you're there and you're in the safety of your community, you let go, you surrender to the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. And you kind of cycle through life like this, right? You walk out of camp, slight engagement, the occasional higher engagement of the nervous system, and then you return back home, go back into the parasympathetic state. Now, the situation we find ourselves in today is drastically different to how it was back there and then. Of course, now the stress doesn't end when we get home, when we land into the apartment, because we have this constant bombardment of stresses coming through social media, coming through the television, coming through the news, coming through these kind of ominous global crises, the environmental crisis, the pandemics, the wars, these kind of background chronic stresses that are constantly occurring, in addition to the ones that we go out and about to meet, the stresses of our work, our employment, the stresses of social engagement, which has become an interesting thing for a social creature to engage in. From the moment we wake up, a notification on our mobile phones can already peak us into that stress response until the moment we go to bed after watching an episode of Netflix where we've had our nervous system heightened by whatever content we were consuming. So we kind of exist in this kind of mild stress response, this mild activation continuously. which never allows us to fully drop into the parasympathetic state. Now, enter all of the plethora of modalities that are designed to bring us from this heightened state of engagement back into a more grounded, deeper parasympathetic state, social engagement state. Things like breath work, things like meditation, things like massage, body work, certain practices, yoga, tai chi, movement practices, all of these things can bring us back into this parasympathetic state. And this is a long list. We're not going to be able to cover all of them. However, what I feel a lot of these modalities miss the mark in, and it's no consequence of the modality itself. It is designed to kind of bring us back into a parasympathetic state, but it doesn't do anything to change the way in which we have structured our lives, the kind of environmental stresses that we have put ourselves within. And if they're not having a direct change on those kind of circumstances, we're inevitably going to go back into them and wind up in another state of stress. So, then we have to go and get our weekly chiropractic adjustment. We have to go get our weekly breathwork fix. We can't miss our morning practice of meditation because otherwise we just are going to crumble. We're tethered to these practices. What would seem to me to be a far useful orientation in meeting stress is to have an adaptive toolkit that has different objectives in order to change the fundamental conditions of our lives such that we can manage our stress more effectively, that we can meet our stresses with a greater sense of ease. So as all of those practices that I've mentioned, I love all of these practices. They're really powerful. They can bring us back into this parasympathetic state. But to my mind, this is where the journey can actually begin. We've come to this parasympathetic state, this grounded, centered space. This is the best place to actually start reflecting, observing, and making changes within our lives such that we don't find ourselves back in the same repeating cycle of pattern. So how we meet our stresses ultimately will impact our long-term longevity, because the stress is here to stay, right? It might peak in different moments of our life, but the stress is here to stay. So the question is, how can we best meet that stress? At this point, I feel it might be useful to circle our conversation specifically to men and how men may be holding themselves back or causing themselves an unnecessary degree of stress by the way in which they're approaching the stress. Now, the stress, we can have these stresses coming from the external world, things that we're existing within our environment that are impacting upon us. But we can also have this bottom-up stress, this kind of internal stress. And what I'm speaking about here is feelings, emotions. Now, as men, we've been told, we've been conditioned, we've been indoctrinated into this idea that it's not okay to express your emotions. It's not okay to feel your emotions. So right from a young age, we sever ourselves from the body, from our emotional response. Now, the thing is that our emotions, our feelings, well, they tell us everything we need to know about the world. The nervous system itself is constantly taking in sensory information, processing it, and signaling to our minds to engage and enact. And if we have cut ourselves off from our embodied emotional compass, then we are navigating the world of darkness, essentially. We are just doing what we think is the best thing. Our emotions, ultimately, they tell us what matters. They tell us in what way those things matter. And they tell us in what degree those things matter. I'll say that again. Emotions, our feelings, tell us what matters, in what way it matters, and to what degree it matters. And if we have numbed ourselves to our emotional experience, when we make a mental decision, we are not necessarily deciding what is a true representation of ourselves or what is a true representation of what we want, the kind of person we are, the kind of person we would like to be in the world. And now, if you're in a situation where you've been making decisions that aren't in alignment with who you truly are, you could see how downstream this is going to start to cause additional stress because you're in situations, you're in relationships, you're in contexts, workplaces that are not in alignment with you. So you're constantly bringing about additional stress. And here's the thing is that the more stressed you are, the less likely you are to feel your feelings. So the more stressed you are, the less likely you are to feel your feelings. The less likely you are to feel your feelings, the more likely you are to make decisions that are not in alignment with what is best for you. And the more you make these kind of decisions, the more likely you're going to find yourself in situations that are going to be more stressful to you. And it can become quickly this vicious cycle of numbness, emotional repression, depression, anxiety, the cascade of things that can come through that will compound across time. All that to say is, if you're in this situation, I feel you. I've been there myself. I've been in places and spaces that were not a representation of who I was and what I truly wanted. And that ate at me from the inside out. But it is possible to come back into connection with the body, come back into feeling, come back into contact with this inner guidance, this embodied wisdom, this emotional compass, these gut feelings that we have. It's a practice. The more we can become aware of these things, we can slowly start to improve the dialogue and communication that we have with our body. So, how can we leverage some of these ideas and create a practice of gradually moving towards meeting stress with ease, a practice of greater capacity to meet that stress? I'm going to propose a few ideas here. To circle back to the original idea around stress, of the stress response being enacted when the situation exceeds our capacity to cope. And I'll add another word, our perceived capacity to cope. There's two key phrases in that statement. One is perception. How do we perceive the situation? And how do we perceive ourselves relative to that situation? The other is action, our capacity to cope. What is our ability to meet the stress of that situation? Now, I find that it's always best to intersect these things at the outset through the body, because when we enact and we make a change to the action, this influences our perception, and then our perception influences our action, and our action goes back to the influence of the perception. So let's enter the space at the edge of the action. So our capacity to cope. And I would introduce here this idea of what I call the yin and yang of stress management. The yang side of this equation is about improving our capacity to cope. This could mean strengthening the body. This could mean becoming more flexible, becoming more adaptable in the way that we meet the physical landscapes, the emotional landscapes of our lives. It might involve proactively planning, scheduling, visioning, studying, learning something that's going to be useful. It's a real active engagement. The idea is to improve or to raise the ceiling of the threshold that we have in containing our stress. We can handle more of those stressful situations. And the other side is the yin practice, the yin side of stress management, which is around acceptance, surrender. It's when we acknowledge that the situation is actually beyond our capacity to do anything. We have no direct influence on the things. We cannot influence the news, what's happening in the world around us. We cannot influence or we cannot control how others are. Maybe we can influence to some degree, but is that the best use of our energy? We cannot ultimately control the way people receive things, the words that people say, the things that people do. These are all outside of our control. And these things we can learn to come to surrender and accept. This is when all those practices become useful. Down regulating in the face of a situation that one cannot control. We can use both sides of this yin and yang of practice to change the way in which we perceive a situation. Now, another thing to say is the nervous system response, the fight or flight response, something that I was very intrigued to discover not so long ago, is that this is just one way in which the sympathetic nervous system can be engaged. Now, the polyvagal theory, parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system, this is still just a theory. We are still discovering so much about the complexity of how this system undergoes change. And the more we discover, the more we realize we didn't know. And it's continually changing field. In addition to the fight and flight response, there is also a tend and befriend response that can arise. Now, this came from the work of a scientist, I believe her name was Shelley Taylor, who was intrigued by how women typically did not respond the same way to stressful situations as did men. And a lot of the early studies around the fight and flight response were done by men on men. So she picked up this thread and investigated what women actually have a tendency to do in times of stress. And she discovered that they are more likely to have a tend and befriend response. This is the impulse to look after their young, their children, and to befriend each other, to come together in a social network, because evolutionarily, this would serve the women and increase the likelihood that they would be able to endure through the stressful situation. Now, to point out here is that this is not just a binary, like men respond in one way with fight and flight and women respond the other. There are men that respond with a tend and befriend response, and there are women that move into a fight and flight response. But it does seem that gender has some kind of bearing on this. And I would argue that perhaps the masculinity and femininity balance within an individual may have some bearing on this. There is some research that is hinting to the fact that the reason that women have longer life expectancies is the way in which they meet stress. So when a stressful situation arises in this modern context, I can imagine that it is far more adaptive to come together into social relations, to engage, to befriend, to tend, than what it is to necessarily fight or flight, because we're no longer out hunting in the savannah. What is perhaps, as I said before, most useful is to have an adaptiveness to engage in both of these responses. So, for a man who is disconnected from his emotional experience, a man that is disconnected to what he's feeling, coming together in a social setting, to come together with other men, may be the thing, may be the medicine for him to regulate his nervous system, not just going off and doing some breath work, not just becoming more productive, not just doing things, but coming together and around community, around sharing. Now, in the men's spaces that I host, there is this opportunity for sharing in circle. And what that invites a man to do is to check in with how he's feeling. And we often guide this to come from the body, or at least beginning in the body, and then being conceptualized into words, being brought before others to be seen, to be heard, and to be held in their experience. What this invites a man into is integration between the left and right hemispheres, this sensing, feeling, and this kind of like words and articulation. They're invited to bring these together in their communication. But also there's an invitation to integrate top down, bottom up, where the body can communicate with the mind and the mind communicates with the body as I articulate what is happening for me. And when I do that in the context of other men, this can be incredibly powerful to bring us back into a state of cohesion, to co-regulate together, because all of a sudden, the experience that I'm up against, the emotions that are unknown coming from within me, the gravity of the situation that I'm up against, all of a sudden, this becomes bearable because I'm not holding it alone. In the spaces we facilitate, at the work we do in Alchemy Brothers, we seek to bring all of these ingredients into a beautiful blend of men's work where we're sharpening each other's swords. We are developing our capacity to fight and flight, our capacity for physicality, for embodiment, for awareness in the world. We're also looking then to drop into a more softer, receptive, surrendered state through breath work, through the ice, through other practices like the Temescal. And we bring in this aspect of community, this emotional regulation, which inevitably leads to nervous system regulation, an extinction of fear, a greater sense of integration, groundedness, calmness in the face of adversity. We bring all of these things together, and our intention is to bring that in service to skill a man to better meet the stress in his life, to make these ideas part of his everyday existence, part of his everyday practice, to bring these ideas into his group of friends, into his communities, into his contexts back home. And if he's held and supported in such a way, if he is primed to meet the stresses with greatest ease, he can become the man he always was meant to be. He can find himself making the decisions that are in greatest alignment to him and the ones that he loves. And this is the power of men's work in meeting stress, meeting emotional regulation. And it's something I'm quite passionate for. And I hope that some of these ideas have come through clearly, coherently, I would love your feedback. I would love to. There were many threads that I could have pulled along the way that I feel were left undone, but somehow I have a sense that we're reaching some kind of a completion here. If what I've shared with you has resonated, if something in there uh, seemed true for you, if you would like to experience this more and further in a group of supportive men, we are going to be hosting our first of Alchemy Sundays, which we will be hosting on the first Sunday of every month. Our first one will be the 2nd of June. The subject is to meet stress with ease. We're going to explore some of what I've discussed. We're going to bring in practices. There's going to be sharing. There's going to be embodiment work. And of course, there's going to be an ice bath surrounded by a group of beautiful men. So I warmly invite you to join us. You can find the links for the event via our social media platforms. I believe it's in the link tree somewhere. And if you would like more support at any point with what I've shared, please reach out to me directly. I would love to have a conversation and see how I can be of service for you.